The American Civil War was a catastrophic event that forever reshaped the United States. It wasn't simply a war between the North and South, but a war over the very soul and future of the nation. Fueled by tensions that had simmered for decades, this war arose over conflicts surrounding slavery, states' rights, and national unity. From the election of Abraham Lincoln to the South's ultimate defeat, the conflict redefined the American identity, abolishing slavery and setting the stage for Reconstruction, a period rife with its own battles over civil rights, citizenship, and healing a fractured nation. The election of 1860 was a pivotal turning point that crystallized the nation's deep-seated divisions. The issue of slavery had long been a source of friction between North and South, with northern states increasingly moving towards abolition and southern states defending slavery as essential to their economy and social structure. For decades, compromises like the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850 had attempted to keep peace by balancing the interests of slave and free states. However, the country's rapid expansion westward reopened the question: would new territories entering the Union permit slavery, or would they be free states? Abraham Lincoln, a member of the newly formed Republican Party, was vocal in his opposition to the expansion of slavery, although he initially maintained that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed. Yet, Lincoln's political platform represented a clear break from decades of compromise, and his popularity in northern states made him an immediate threat to the South. His election without a single electoral vote from the South intensified Southern fears that they were being politically marginalized. Lincoln's victory triggered a swift reaction. South Carolina seceded from the Union on December 28, 1860, declaring that it no longer considered itself bound by the U.S. Constitution. Within months, 6 other southern states did the same thing, and on February 4, 1861, they established the Confederate States of America, electing Jefferson Davis as president. To these states, Lincoln's election signaled that the federal government was now openly hostile to their way of life, a way of life built upon and sustained by slavery. Their leaders claimed the right to secede, arguing that they were defending their constitutional rights, their economy, and their social structure. The beginning of the Civil War came on April 12, 1861 at Fort Sumter, a military post in Charleston, South Carolina. Confederate forces led by General Beauregard opened fire on the fort held by a small Union garrison under Major Robert Anderson. After 34 hours of continuous bombardment, Anderson surrendered. Fort Sumter's fall electrified the North and South alike. It was clear that war had begun, and both sides braced for conflict. Lincoln responded swiftly, calling for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. In the North, this call was met with overwhelming support, as thousands of young men enlisted, many believing that the conflict would be brief and decisive. The South, in turn, saw Lincoln's action as an act of aggression, prompting Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina to join the Confederacy. The nation was now split, with the North industrial, populous, and committed to preserving the Union on one side, and the South agrarian, less populous, and devoted to the defense of slavery on the other. Both sides initially believed that victory would come quickly. The North was confident in its advantages: a large population, greater industrial capacity, and a vast railroad network for moving troops and supplies. The South, however, was equally determined, believing that it could leverage its martial culture, skilled generals, and commitment to defending its homeland to outlast the Union's will to fight. Furthermore, Southern leaders hoped that Britain and France, both reliant on Southern cotton for their textile industries, might recognize the Confederacy and provide military assistance. But the first major battle of the war, the first Battle of Bull Run on July 21st, 1861, dispelled these illusions. In a chaotic and bloody confrontation, Confederate forces routed the Union Army, sending Northern soldiers and civilians who had gathered to watch the show, fleeing back to Washington, D.C. in a panic. With both sides now realizing the war would be prolonged, each developed strategic goals that would guide their campaigns. The Union, seeking to restore national unity, implemented the Anaconda Plan, a strategy devised by General Winfield Scott. This plan aimed to choke the Confederacy economically by blockading its ports and seizing control of the Mississippi River, thereby splitting the South in half and cutting off its access to critical supplies and trade. The Union blockade, while initially porous, became increasingly effective over time, strangling the Confederate economy by preventing the export of cotton and the import of war supplies. The South's strategy, by contrast, was primarily defensive. Confederate leaders hoped to protect their territory from Union invasion, fighting a war of attrition that would eventually exhaust the North's resources and resolve. They also pursued a diplomatic strategy aimed at securing European recognition and support. Confederate leaders believed that Europe's reliance on cotton would compel Britain and France to intervene on their behalf. But this hope proved ill-founded. Although the British and French ruling classes had some sympathy for the Confederacy, popular opinion in both countries favored the abolitionist cause. Moreover, both nations found alternative sources of cotton in Egypt and India, reducing their economic dependence on the South. The early years of the war were marked by significant battles that foreshadowed the conflict's brutal nature. The Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, fought in Tennessee, was one of the bloodiest encounters of the war up to that point. Union forces managed to hold their ground against a surprise Confederate assault, ultimately forcing the South to withdraw. The Battle of Shiloh was a wake-up call, exposing the horrifying realities of the war, with nearly 24,000 casualties. It was clear that the conflict would be neither quick nor easy. While the Union initially fought solely to preserve the nation, by mid-1862 it became clear that the issue of slavery could not be separated from the war's purpose. Lincoln, who had long hated slavery but prioritized saving the Union, recognized that ending slavery could weaken the Confederacy and give the North a moral advantage. In September 1862, following the Union's narrow victory at the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln announced his intention to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1, 1863, declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-controlled territories were to be set free. This executive order did not immediately free any enslaved individuals, as it applied only to areas under Confederate control, not to border states still loyal to the Union or to already occupied Confederate areas. Nonetheless, the proclamation fundamentally changed the nature of the war. It transformed the Union's cause from merely preserving the nation to also abolishing slavery, giving the conflict a higher moral purpose. The Emancipation Proclamation had significant political and military effects. In the North, it galvanized the abolitionist movement and gave new motivation to Union soldiers who now saw themselves as fighting for human freedom. It also allowed for the enlistment of African American soldiers, who would play a critical role in the Union war effort. Approximately 180,000 black soldiers joined the Union Army, many of whom were former slaves, eager to fight for their own liberation and the future of their people. In the Confederacy, the proclamation hardened Southern resolve. Confederate leaders viewed it as an attempt to incite rebellion among enslaved people, and Southern civilians feared the prospect of a slave uprising. At the same time, the proclamation made it nearly impossible for Britain and France to support the Confederacy openly. With the Union now firmly committed to abolition, any European intervention on behalf of the South would appear as a support for slavery, a stance unacceptable to British and French publics. The year of 1863 was a turning point in the Civil War, marked by two significant Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1st to July 3rd, was one of the largest and most consequential battles of the war. General Robert E. Lee, hoping to bring the war into the North and demoralize the Union, launched an invasion of Pennsylvania. The two armies met at Gettysburg, where over 3 days they fought one of the bloodiest battles in American history, with approximately 50,000 casualties. The Union, commanded by General George Meade, ultimately defeated Lee's forces, forcing them to retreat back to Virginia. Gettysburg was a catastrophic loss for the Confederacy, making the end of Lee's attempt to take the fight into Northern Territory. It also had a profound impact on Confederate morale and resources, which were already stretched thin. Lee's failure at Gettysburg shifted the momentum of the war decisively in favor of the Union. Simultaneously, Union forces under General Grant achieved a major victory at Vicksburg, Mississippi. The city of Vicksburg was strategically vital as it commanded control over the Mississippi River. Grant's troops laid siege to Vicksburg for several months, cutting off supplies and bombarding the city. On July 4, 1863, the Confederate garrison at Vicksburg surrendered, giving the Union control of the Mississippi River and effectively splitting the Confederacy in two. The fall of Vicksburg was a crushing blow to the South, isolating Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas from the rest of Confederacy and bolstering the Union's control of the Western theater. These twin victories, Gettysburg in the east and Vicksburg in the west, marked a major turning point in the war. The Confederacy was now on the defensive. Its resources were declining, and its prospects for victory increasingly bleak. Following the pivotal victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the Union, under the leadership of President Lincoln and others, intensified its war efforts. Grant was appointed as General-in-Chief of the Union Army in March 1864, a move that consolidated Union military leadership under one command. With Grant in this role, the Union adopted a strategy of total war, an approach that sought not only to defeat the Confederate armies, but also to dismantle the South's economy and morale, targeting both military and civilian resources. The concept of total war was rooted in the belief that South's civilian infrastructure directly supported the Confederate war effort. Railroads transported soldiers and supplies, plantations produced food, and towns supplied weapons and other resources. Grant's aim was to exhaust the South's capacity to sustain the war, and his plans included two main initiatives: his overland campaign in Virginia, aimed directly at Lee's army, and Sherman's campaign through the Deep South. Sherman's campaign, often remembered as Sherman's March to the Sea, exemplified the brutal realities of total war. After capturing Atlanta in September 1864, a critical victory that significantly boosted Northern morale and Lincoln's re-election prospects, Sherman set out on a march through Georgia. His army moved from Atlanta to Savannah, destroying railroads, factories, and farms along the way. The objective was not only to cripple the Confederate war effort by cutting off supplies and transportation, but also to break the will of the Southern people, forcing them to question the value of continued resistance. Sherman's march caused widespread devastation. His troops burned crops, tore up railroads, and confiscated supplies. Southern civilians, who had largely been spared from the direct effect of the war up to this point, now faced the harsh realities of a conflict that had ravaged much of their homeland. While Sherman's methods were controversial and drew condemnation from the South, they proved effective in accelerating the end of the war. By December 1864, Sherman reached Savannah, capturing the city and offering it to Lincoln as a Christmas gift. While Sherman was devastating Georgia, Grant was engaged in a relentless campaign against Lee's army in northern Virginia. The Overland Campaign, which began in May 1864, involved a series of brutal battles, including the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor. Unlike previous Union generals, Grant did not retreat after suffering heavy casualties. He continued to press Lee's army, willing to sustain losses in order to wear down Confederate forces. This relentless pursuit demonstrated Grant's resolve and earned him the nickname the Butcher, due to the high number of Union casualties. The Overland Campaign ultimately led to the siege of Petersburg, which began in June 1864 and lasted for nearly 10 months. Petersburg was a strategic railroad hub that supplied Richmond, the Confederate capital, with troops and provisions. Grant's army encircled Petersburg, cutting off supplies and reinforcements, and engaged in trench warfare similar to the tactics that would later define the First World War. The siege was grueling for both sides, but the Confederacy, already struggling with food shortages and declining resources, was particularly hard hit. Civilians in Richmond suffered from starvation, and Confederate soldiers were leaving in increasing numbers due to poor conditions and low morale. By early 1865, the Confederate position was unsustainable. In April, after months of attrition, Grant launched a final offensive that broke through Lee's defenses at Petersburg. The fall of Petersburg forced Lee to evacuate Richmond, and the Confederate government fled as Union troops entered the capital. On April 9, 1865, with his army surrounded and outnumbered, Lee surrendered to Grant. The formal surrender marked the end of the Civil War, though pockets of Confederate resistance continued for several weeks. Grant's treatment of Lee and his men was notably lenient. In a gesture aimed at healing the divided nation, Grant allowed Confederate soldiers to return home with their horses and personal belongings, and he ensured that they would not be prosecuted for treason. This approach symbolized the Union's desire for reconciliation and foreshadowed the difficult process of reconstruction that lay ahead. As the war raged on the battlefields, it also deeply affected civilian life on both sides. In the north, industry boomed as factories produced weapons, ammunition, uniforms, and other supplies for the war effort. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking on roles in manufacturing, nursing, and administration to support the war. Figures like Clara Barton, who would later found the American Red Cross, emerged as pioneering nurses who provided crucial medical care on the front lines. The war thus helped to challenge traditional gender roles, laying the groundwork for the broader women's rights movement that would gain momentum in the decades following the war. In the South, the war brought severe hardships. The Union blockade and the loss of manpower to the Confederate Army led to widespread food shortages. Inflation skyrocketed, and Confederate currency became virtually worthless by the end of the war. Southern women, many of whom had no prior experience managing households or plantations without male oversight, took on new responsibilities. Some worked as nurses, others as spies, and many were left to manage farms and businesses with few resources. The toll of the war on Southern civilians was immense, leaving many families destitute and disillusioned by the Confederacy's promises of victory. For African Americans, the Civil War represented both a period of intense hardship and a path to liberation. Enslaved people in Confederate states found ways to resist and undermine the Southern war effort, with many escaping to Union lines where they could find freedom and in many cases enlist as soldiers. Following the Emancipation Proclamation, approximately 180,000 black men joined the Union Army and Navy, serving in segregated units under white officers. Although these soldiers faced discrimination and were often relegated to manual labor or dangerous assignments, their contributions were invaluable. The bravery of African American soldiers, particularly in battles like the assault on Fort Wagner by the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, challenged racist assumptions and helped to shift Northern attitudes toward black rights. President Lincoln's leadership throughout the war was marked by his pragmatic approach, his ability to communicate effectively with the public, and his commitment to preserving the Union above all else. Initially, Lincoln faced significant opposition from within his own party and from Northern Democrats, who criticized his handling of the war and opposed his stance on slavery. The 1864 election was particularly contentious, with Lincoln running for re-election against former Union General George McClellan, who ran on a platform that favored a negotiated peace with the Confederacy. The capture of Atlanta in September 1864 proved to be a turning point in the election, boosting Northern morale and helping to secure Lincoln's re-election. In his second inaugural address, delivered in March 1865, Lincoln expressed a vision of reconciliation and healing. Lincoln's words reflected his belief that the nation's survival depended on its ability to forgive and rebuild, setting the tone for the Reconstruction era. Lincoln's assassination on April 14, 1865, just days after Lee's surrender, shocked the nation and cast a shadow over the initial efforts to reunify the country. His death deprived the nation of a leader uniquely capable of balancing firmness and compassion, and his successor, Andrew Johnson, would struggle to implement a coherent and effective Reconstruction policy.